The rise of right-wing extremism in Europe. An anti-Islamic, anti-immigration party won nearly a fifth of the vote in France. Right-wing bigotry is becoming popular throughout the continent. Why? And who is responsible for the growth of these parties? Hello and welcome to A Simple Question with me, Phil Rees. The European Council on Foreign Relations has compared the Islamaphobic rhetoric of far-right political parties today with the anti-Semitic speeches of the Nazis in the 1930s. So where is all this heading? Well, before we find out what the public thinks here on the streets of London, here's a short video clip.
The leader of France's National Front, Marine Le Pen, surprised the country by coming third in the first round of the country's presidential election. Her 18% of the vote transformed the leader of the anti-immigrant Nationalist Party from an electoral competitor into a key player. The National Front's pet themes, immigration, security and national identity, defined the election agenda in France. The strength of the National Front has allowed voters to shrug off accusations that they speak a language of bigotry that was previously taboo. But France's slide to the right is becoming commonplace in Europe. With the continent paralysed by economic problems, politicians have increasingly played a populist tune, often blaming immigrants for their troubles. The President of the European Union, Herman Van Rompuy, has criticised what he calls the winds of populism blowing across Europe, fanned by extremist movements. Far-right parties across the Eurozone are establishing a foothold, even in traditionally liberal Scandinavia. In the Netherlands, Geert Wilders, leader of the anti-immigrant, anti-Islam Freedom Party, helped to bring down the government and is in third place and rising in polls ahead of September's elections. Austria's Freedom Party under Heinz-Christian Strache is currently neck and neck in the polls with the governing Social Democrats. Much of the right-wing venom is directed specifically against Muslims. What's equally concerning is that mainstream politicians have often responded to the growing support for the far-right parties by taking on many of their policies. During the past year, a ban on praying in the street came into force in France, causing thousands of Muslim worshippers to pray in makeshift sites. The ban is the latest in a seeming onslaught against Muslim culture and traditions. Belgium, Italy, Denmark, Austria, the Netherlands and Switzerland either already have or are planning similar legislation prohibiting the wearing of a niqab in public. 2 years ago, Switzerland voted to prevent the building of new minarets. A report by Amnesty International identified widespread prejudice and said political leaders, rather than combating fear of Islamic extremism, have been pandering to prejudice against Muslims in a quest for votes. There is also an increase in right-wing terrorism, such as last year's carnage in Norway when Anders Breivik killed 77 people in attacks that he claims were necessary in order to fight a civil war against Islam in Europe. With far-right politics so strongly focused on anti-Islamic sentiment, what is the future for Muslim communities in Europe?
A Simple Question is a show that finds out what the public thinks here on the streets of London. I began today by asking people what they know about the rise of far-right parties in Europe. Why are they becoming popular and what are their policies?
I've heard various political opinions coming from the ex-president of Italy, Berlusconi, which really shook me. I thought quite racist comments about people who are important and intrinsic to the Italian, to the progress of Italy, because we need immigrants. So I don't understand really their policies.
What do you know about the rise of far-right parties in Europe and what do you think their policies are?
Well, as a general rule, you always find with economic collapse there tends to be a rise in right-wing politics throughout history. So it seems to be always a retreat into nationalism when you find that there's economic distress.
The politics is normally, I would say, that just pointing on other groups which are not identical to the public that you are looking at and try to create hate.
I think it's a kind of in some ways referring back to the Hitler kind of era, where they just kind of want to stick to their own kind of nationality and not have kind of any encroachment from other nations.
What do you know about the rise in popularity of far-right parties in Europe?
I wouldn't say I'm an expert, but obviously what's happening in France with Marine Le Pen, and what is it, 20% of the vote that they won, and that's the only stat I'd have in my head about going to far right. But also this chap in Hungary who's a bit of a extreme. And then sort of generally the backdrop in Germany around, it's a bubbling issue, but I think the two new points for me in my head are what's happening in France and what's happening in Hungary.
Well, I'm aware there's a kind of resurgence as far as the far right is concerned, although it's never really gone away. It's always been there. I think in Europe it's always been this kind of underlying, trend tendency that currently appears to be making something of a resurgence, which is very worrying.
Why do you think the far-right groups in general are becoming more popular in Europe?
I think it has a lot to do with economical crisis, and people tend to think that left-wing parties are on the rise then, because people are afraid of what they have.
I think it's coming from the young people. I think they see their parents have not done as well as they want to do. And I think they think that if they're provided for, that they have a better chance of succeeding, rather than getting a really good education and going out and becoming an entrepreneur or doing something that they really enjoy doing and turning it into a hobby. I don't care whether it's skateboarding, learning how to make skateboards. I just think that you're better off if you can control your own money. And I see more and more problems coming up down the road because of this.
Why do you think that these far-right groups are gaining popularity, in France, in Holland, in Greece, in fact throughout Europe?
I guess they fear for their share of their share being eroded.
Going back in history, it's always the case when there's an economic crisis and when the native people of every country are suffering. The first people they blame are immigrants.
Well, those are the views of people here on the streets of London. Let's now find out what our experts think.
Over the past decade or so, you have seen the rise of a whole number of far-right parties across Europe in a number of countries. I mean, the obvious example would be the National Front in France that did disturbingly well in the first round of the French presidential elections a week ago. Their candidate Marine Le Pen got nearly 18% of the vote, which is the best they've ever done. There's the Freedom Party, headed by Geert Wilders in the Netherlands, which recently managed to bring down the Dutch government because it withdrew its support. Across Europe, you've seen the emergence of such parties. There's the Freedom Party BZO in Austria, there's Vlaams Belang in Belgium, you've got the Sweden Democrats, the Danish People's Party. In Britain, you have a kind of small-scale version of that with the British National Party. As to what their programme is, they tend to be quite pragmatic, not to say opportunistic about that. I mean, if you look at the National Front back in the 1980s, they were enthusiastic supporters of Ronald Reagan's free market ideology. These days, they're advocating protectionism and defending French industry behind tariff barriers, behind trade barriers. So on something as central as the economy, over a space of a few decades, they've completely reversed their position. What they all have in common is that they appeal to voters by inciting hatred against the Muslim community. I think that's the distinguishing feature of all these far-right parties. They feed voters a paranoid fantasy about how Muslim communities of migrant origin are trying to take over the West and impose Islamic dictatorships on the indigenous people. That's the kind of line they put, and that's the basis on which they appeal for support. More generally, I think that the far right over the past decade or so has been able to repackage itself. I mean, a lot of these parties, the obvious exception being Wilders' party in the Netherlands, but a lot of these parties have origins in the fascist movement. They were set up by neo-Nazis, and they've repackaged themselves now as kind of right-wing populist parties. They've played down anti-Semitism and concentrated on attacking Muslims, and that's provided favourable conditions for them to grow. People will vote for them who wouldn't vote for an openly Nazi party, but because they package themselves as something different. The case that the far-right targets Muslims particularly these days, and I think the reason they do that is partly because they genuinely do hate Muslims. They really do believe that Islam represents a threat to the West. So they're not sort of pretending. However, you know, I don't think that, say, in Britain, a party like the British National Party has ceased to hate Hindus or Sikhs or people of African Caribbean heritage. One of the reasons why they specifically target Muslims is they know that it has some resonance among the general population. I mean, Nick Griffin, the leader of the British National Party, has said in the past, you know, if we go around going on about the, you know, the Jews trying to take over the world, no one will listen to us. They'll think we're just cranks if we say that the Muslims are invading the West and trying to take over. That's the sort of thing that people hear in the mainstream right-wing press, and they're going to give us a hearing. So I think there's a kind of an opportunistic element to it, as well as the fact that they genuinely are, you know, rabidly Islamophobic.
The bulk of the electoral support for the far right is constituted of typically middle-aged, white, blue-collar workers. So individuals who feel that effectively they have lost out due to globalization. They have less job security, they have lower pay or stagnating real pay, and they feel that effectively, rather than benefiting from globalization, they're effectively on the losing end. And the immigration issue does tie in with this quite closely, because of course, not only in obvious terms, immigrants are in some sense the most visible representation of globalization, but it's also very easy to scapegoat them and effectively blame them for changes in the labor market, changes also in terms of working conditions and so on. So really the lion's share of the electoral support comes from effectively the autonomous working class. That said, the far right, I think, has understood that it needs to broaden its electoral base. It's reaching out to female voters. It's also I think in a number of countries, the far right has also effectively changed its rhetoric and its policy a little bit. It's no longer quite as overtly racist. It is no longer effectively offensively targeting individuals based on race or skin color. It's moved towards a more sophisticated form of xenophobia, and in so doing, it actually manages also to speak to the second generation of descendants of immigrants. That might seem a bit surprising, but in France, for example, the National Front does secure votes amongst Frenchmen and women of Algerian descent. So it's not as simple as it used to be, effectively, where the far right very clearly polarized communities and spoke effectively only for white Europeans. It really, in some sense, I think, at least in a number of European countries, has moved a bit beyond that.
A report published by Chatham House, the London-based think tank, says that support for right-wing movements is growing because Europeans fear losing their cultural identity in the face of what they see as a threat from Muslims living here. But Muslims make up less than 5% of the population of most European countries. France has the largest Muslim community with perhaps 7 or 8%. So how can the identity of the majority, 90% or 95%, be threatened by such a minority? And are there any similarities in what's going on now in Europe with the rise of anti-Semitism before the Second World War?
It's the bullying tactic, isn't it? I mean, it's from the playground upwards. It's perhaps a little simplistic to say, but it is that horrible bullying element. You see maybe a group that is culturally identifiable and is a distinct group, and you take a groundswell of a kind of really obnoxious views and you amplify those.
Many of these far-right groups target in particular Muslims, and there's been a significant growth in Islamophobia. Why do you think that Muslims are kind of the particular victim of attack of these groups?
Well, I suppose at least in France is reaping what it sowed in colonialism with so many, and Muslims also, I suppose, are more easily identifiable as a group of others, and appear to have a different lifestyle to sort of native-born Europeans, so they're an easy target.
because it's always the incredibly negative stuff which gets remembered and which gets portrayed a lot in the media. You know, you don't hear about all the Muslims in this country who are working really hard to like better their community around them and to bond together with all the other like races and creeds and religions in this country to make something really special. People, because like the media and because people like the BNP continue to feed back that image of look out, be scared by these people, and then try and offer them a solution as to what they're going to do about it.
London think tank Chatham House has drawn parallels between the rise of anti-Semitism in Germany in the 1930s with this growing Islamophobia in Europe. Do you think that's fair?
No, but then I worry about saying no because that's what people said in 1930s Germany. I don't think we're at that stage yet. But I think there's a risk that could happen.
You know, I'm Jewish, so definitely I can say that there are similarities. The similarities are the same. The reason why the politicians are doing that is not because they have something to do, they're just taking advantages of the hate of the public in order to unite them and bring them into power. Look into history. I mean, the Jewish people, maybe they've been different from the rest of the public, but they did nothing wrong. But it was easy for some groups to go into power by using that, by pointing other groups as the wrong groups and unite the others behind them. So I think it's keep repeating itself by threatening the people that this group of people would do things to you and they would ruin your life and everything would be done to you that way. Nothing to do with that.
Oh, completely. Again, because it's scapegoating. Largely, as I say, like people, particularly considering we just had an economic crash in this country not that long ago. There was an economic crash back in 1929, which had a massive effect on Weimar Berlin, which is exactly when, before that economic crash, the Nazis were a laughable, extremist party. No one took them seriously at all. After the economic crash, when the mainstream parties weren't able to offer solutions to that crash, that's when the Nazis started gaining credence, because people were scared and they were poor and they were looking for people who offered strong leadership and strong answers.
So different views there from the public here on the streets of London. Let's now find out what our experts have to say.
There are parallels between Islamophobia and traditional anti-Semitism. Not least because in both cases you have minority, non-Christian communities, ethno-religious communities being targeted for attack. And the way in which those attacks are formulated, there are some parallels there. I mean, traditional anti-Semitism tended to have recourse to paranoid conspiracy theories. You know, there was even a fraudulent document called the Protocols of the Elders of Zion that was forged by the Tsarist secret police in the early 20th century that was supposedly about Jews plotting to take over the world. And a lot of the way in which Islamophobia is framed has some parallels with that. You know, there's something called the Eurabia thesis, which alleges that European governments came to an agreement with various Arab regimes to flood Europe with Muslim immigrants, and these Muslims are now going to outbreed us. You know, they will take over within a matter of decades. You know, the Muslims will have conquered the West, and it's all framed in terms of that kind of conspiracy theory. I think the governments could assist in countering the influence of the far right by, well, for one thing, by avoiding using the same kind of rhetoric themselves. I mean, we can see that in France with Sarkozy, you know, very much making a pitch for the supporters of Marine Le Pen and going on about, you know, the threat posed by halal meat and Muslims forced to pray in the street because they don't have mosques to go to, presenting this as some threat to French identity. I mean, so if governments, if mainstream political parties would stop using that kind of rhetoric, it would certainly assist. I also think there's a need to take some positive action to suppress some of these far-right organisations. I mean, in Britain there was an attempt to introduce a religious hatred law by the last Labour government, which unfortunately was sabotaged by the House of Lords. And consequently, the law that came in is completely useless. I mean, it's virtually impossible to prosecute somebody for inciting religious hatred. So I think that law needs to be revisited. We do need laws to stop people inciting hatred against Muslims. We have laws to stop people inciting hatred against Jews or black people. I think Muslims should have the same defence and support. And also, I think that when far-right organisations make explicit threats against the Muslim community, as they frequently do, the English Defence League and its supporters repeatedly make threats against Muslims. Well, they should be cracked down on in the way that small extremist Muslim groups are. I mean, back in 2007, there were a number of supporters of al-Muhajirin who were jailed for between 4 and 6 years for chanting bomb, bomb, bomb Denmark. It was during a protest against the Danish anti-Islam cartoons. They were jailed for that. And yet you have supporters of the English Defence League calling for violence against Muslims and supporters of the Muslim community, and nothing's done about that. So I think there's a need to use the law against these people in a way that presently isn't being done.
My assessment is that effectively the far right comes and goes in waves, and we had an earlier wave in the late 60s when there was effectively the beginning of the slowdown of the post-war economic boom. That effectively then went away. We had a lot of controversial statements, a lot of even outlandish policy suggestions submitted in the 1980s when asylum figures were quite high. And in France, of course, there was a long and protracted debate over the benefits of having a relatively liberal and generous citizenship policy for the second generation. And now we have effectively a renaissance of the far right because of, I must say, the fairly serious ramifications of the economic crisis, because the perception that too much energy and capital is expanded on saving the euro and not enough is being placed on effectively trying to create jobs and secure livelihoods. And I think there's a sentiment that immigration policy has been too liberal. If you look at the opinion polls, you will find there is a majority of European voters across the EU 27 against more immigration. But I honestly also do think that effectively this is not a political force that is here to stay. That is to say, I think the support will be waning again. But that is not an automatic cyclical development. It does require a little bit of political action to be taken.
What would happen to Europe if right-wing parties became even more popular or even formed a government? What would it mean for Muslim communities and for multiculturalism? And what can be done to try to prevent their continuing popularity? Well, let's find out what the public thinks here on the streets of London.
I think possibly we could have some serious conflicts, serious, awful consequences. And I think we need to do everything we possibly can to prevent that from happening.
If a far-right government took power in a European country, what do you think that would mean for the kind of principle of multiculturalism, which Western Europe has basically embraced in the post-war years? And also, what would it mean for Muslim communities in these countries?
Well, I think for Muslim communities it would be very worrying, because I say if someone could be elected in France or Hungary, then it might happen here, and obviously give lots of support and succour to the right wing in this country. About
encouraging people to go back, although they may have been born there, been born in Holland or been born in France and so on, not necessarily coming over from Algeria or from Afghanistan or whatever. There are plenty of people of Asian origin here and West Indian origin who are born here. You can't really send them back to, whence their fathers and grandfathers came from.
What do you think can be done to prevent the growth of right-wing parties in Europe?
That's a tough one. I don't think you can do a lot. I think they will... It's like a wave. Right wing is on the rise now, but at some point people will see that they don't have all the answers to all the problems, and then they will turn back to the other side, and left wing will be on the rise. And maybe in 5 or 6 years you'll be doing this interview about the rise of left wing parties.
What government should do, they should, instead of put fire up, they should cool down the fire and try to bridge between all communities.
I think the most important thing is education. But I think as well, I think educate both sides.
Well, the first thing they could do is really celebrate the success that all communities bring to the countries that they are part of, rather than kind of this notion that they're the enemy within, is actually to celebrate the successes that those communities bring to our communities.
I'm afraid that's all we've got time for this week. Thanks so much for joining us. If you've got something to say yourself, send an email to asimplequestion@presstv.com. That's asimplequestion@presstv.com. Well, we're taking a short break now. We'll be back in a couple of months. Looking forward to see you then. Take care.